And so we've struck duplex out of all of the architectural review standards. And then Dave's going to talk about the zoning aspect of that. The other thing with the architectural review standards is the legislature, and again, Dave's kind of taken most of this, but some of it is affected by the architectural review standards. In the state legislature bill defined a multifamily as a 5-plex or greater, and in our regulations and for architectural review, it was duplex, townhouse, and then we called it multifamily, which would be 3 units or more. So we had to go through all the standards and add 2-unit townhouse, triplex, 4-plex, and then multifamily to make sure that we're continuing to review all the things that we've always reviewed. So that's kind of the gist of it for the architectural review stuff. Just to clarify too, so now duplexes can be allowed everywhere, but that is a different type of housing unit than a townhouse. A townhouse is an attached single family where the property line goes down the middle of a building and folks own their unit plus the dirt, where a duplex is typically more of a rental where there's 2 families under one roof and it's all owned by one person. So we've clarified those definitions as well in the architectural review standards as well as in the zoning regulations. So Senate Bill 407 is the one that is prohibiting jurisdictions from using an exterior design review board as a decision maker on architectural review stuff. But we are going to be planning, and actually it took effect immediately, we are planning under Senate Bill 382, which is the new Montana Land Use Planning Act. And so we are going to continue to use an architectural review committee, but it's just going to be advisory instead of a decision-making group. And then kind of a funny little thing, because staff will be the final decision-making body for architectural review, all decisions of the zoning administrator go to the Board of Adjustment. We have appeals go to the City Council. But again, in the 18 years I've been here, I think we've had 3 appeals or maybe 2. So this is a really good group that really works hard with applicants to make really good projects. Again, we took these items to the City Council in a work session, which is the memo that you folks received, and they were generally supportive of our approach. We also changed the shalls to the more defensible musts. We're kind of doing that as we kind of make amendments. So while you guys don't really have the authority to make changes to the committee, I included that section just so you could see how the committee, under the committee section, how that's going to read, that they're making recommendations. Mostly it's just changing that the architectural review standards apply to everything except single family and duplex. We had a little provision in the sign regulations that the architectural review committee would review. We have a provision where you can get a monument sign and you can have some little architectural embellishment as a percentage of the sign, but if it goes greater than that, it goes to the architectural review committee. So we'll still have them look at it, but they'll make a recommendation to staff. So that was an amendment to the sign code. We did take out the section about the billboards being removed within 7 years because that time frame has passed. And we have 1 billboard that's out on Highway 93 by the LDS Church, and we have a bond that'll come down the end of this year, actually. And let's see if there's any other kind of highlights. I think that's about it. Oh, there was another kind of funny section of that Senate Bill 407 was that variances had to be reviewed by staff to the design review standards. Again, that isn't something we often see. There's just so many opportunities for people to do what they want to do, you know, within kind of the bounds of the architectural review committee, but we did add a sentence about that. I also added that the business transitional district and the business service district, which are those areas that will be south of Highway 40, I guess south is highway, would fall into the highway district because we didn't actually have them called out as a particular type of district. So that is about it for that one. And the architecture review committee has looked at this a couple different times and didn't have any concerns with it. Can I answer any questions for you?
Thank you, Wendy. Any questions for Wendy?
Regarding duplexes, so you're saying a duplex is part of an individual tax lot. It can't be its own tax lot, even if it's a 0 lot line?
Right, so the 0 lot line, the 0 lot line is a townhouse. It has a property line down the middle of the building. They touch.
So this is, so a duplex, A duplex is a housing unit with another housing unit attached, or it has to be attached as well?
Yeah, they're
And
attached.
what's considered a housing unit?
On one lot, yeah, on one lot.
On one lot, and it's
Where a
gotta be
townhouse would
attached.
have sublots. They each have their own
Gotcha.
lot.
Additionally, the state is, I just looked into this actually this morning, considering a duplex is a single meter that services
Yeah.
two
That's the
households.
next
That is
question.
the other-
So is
Yeah.
it power meter, water meter as well?
One
Yeah.
meter,
So
yeah.
it needs
we're-
to have one meter. If it has more than one, it becomes a townhouse?
If each side, each unit has its own metering, then yeah, it's a townhouse.
Either meter, either water or power?
Well, usually that's how
I think
they,
it's just defined as utilities.
always.
it's just utilities, yeah.
Well, you could
Utilities
I
are
can get two
separate.
power meters and have one water meter. That's still possible.
But the city's utilities will do a separate meter for each unit if they're
Okay.
townhouses. And they'll do one meter if it's a duplex or a condo building.
Okay?
Yeah.
So it needs to not be fee simple, its own tax lot, but it needs to have its own meter to be a duplex.
I guess I can't remember how we ended up defining
I'm
it.
just
I think it's
curious, like-
actually in Dave's,
It's confusing, isn't
Dave's
it?
section.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought it was the other way around. If it was fee simple, its own tax lot, it was a townhouse.
We don't define them about meters, but a duplex, we're changing the definition and improving it, but it's going to be a single structure constructed with two dwelling units under a single roof on a single lot for occupancy by two families, either side by side with a common party wall and a roof, or on separate floors, also referred to as a two-family dwelling. And then a townhome is defined as, or townhouse, a single-family dwelling unit located on its own lot with its own individual services, constructed in a group of two or more attached units, in which each unit extends from foundation to roof with a 2-hour fire-rated party wall between the units with no openings. A townhouse does not share a common floor or ceiling with other dwelling units.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, the big thing I get out of it, it's its own tax lot. That's
Right.
essentially, it can be sold independent of the other one, whereas this duplex can, it sounds like.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, we have seen some townhouses get condominiumized, but it's
Okay,
pretty
yeah.
rare. It's pretty rare.
But then they'd be their own tax lot at that point anyways, so it
Well,
would
it's
fit in.
airspace, not, I mean, they share common ownership
Sure.
of a lot if it's a
Well, that happens,
condominium.
there's townhouses now that are condoized, like I think some in my neighborhood, that they're townhouses, but they have a condo association within the two townhouses.
Ugh, that just adds complications, but whatever.
Yeah, but they can be sold independently.
They
That's
can.
where it kind of comes down to,
But a
what I'm
condo
thinking.
is different than a townhouse.
correct.
Can I follow up on that,
Sure,
Chris?
yeah.
Is there any language related to separate sale of the separate units in that?
I don't remember.
Could they be, if they were condominiumized, could they be
a
sold?
duplex could be condominiumized, but it's not part of our subdivision regulations, so we don't really regulate that. But they'd have to come up with their own HOA users agreement, who's doing the
But it
maintenance of
could-
the
it's
roof or
feasible.
the yard. Feasibly, yes.
So for instance, I'm in an HOA that has condos within it, and they look as though they're townhouses, and some are, but some are actual condos within that. So, yeah, for the
For this
purposes of
purpose,
this, yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Just in general, so just seeing this is like basically a huge upzone that is being done. I mean, you can basically take the property now and build more than one unit, which was a single family.
Yeah, and that's Dave's text amendment. He's going to talk about that
Okay.
next. This is just the Architectural Review
Sure.
Committee making them
So
advisory.
basically what's happening is architectural review is having their ability to be they're just an advisory committee like we are now.
Right, and like most committees, I mean, only the Board of Adjustment makes decision, and Park Board, they're the only two committees. So, I mean, it's kind of more keeping them in line with kind of all the other committees.
Okay.
Thanks, Wendy.
Mm-hmm.
David? Do you have anything did you want, no? Okay, it looked like you were going to say something. All right. Comments from the board?
Have a couple of grammatical things in here on the changes that you guys made. On page 16, where it's list of items, and you struck is and put are, it still is, unless you want to get rid of list, and then it's are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
And then on page 20, under chapter 6, everywhere else that you have the word multifamily, you have structure just after it, and the first time you use it on that page, you didn't add structure,
Oh, okay, yeah.
So,
I'll
there.
add that.
and that's it for this. Looks good.
Thank you.
Other comments from the board? Wendy, do you want to see something formal on those grammatical changes, or?
I'll just make them.
Okay. With that, then we'll seek a motion.
Open the public hearing first.
Thank you. Would anyone from the public like to speak? Public comment is closed, as there is no public here. Now we'll go to the motion. Thank you, Dave.
I'll make a motion to approve WZTA 23-05.
I'll second it.
First and seconded, all in favor, show of hands, please. The motion passes unanimously. And we will move on to staff report WZTA 23-06.
So this one's a little more complicated. So there were several bills that were passed, Senate Bill 245, as well as Senate Bill 323, which required us to make some significant changes to our zoning code. As Wendy talked about, Senate Bill 245 went into effect immediately. This one actually we didn't talk about, which requires any municipality with a population over 5,000 people to allow multifamily dwellings, which is 5 or more units, in all commercially zoned districts by right, as well as mixed-use developments, which include multifamily. And so we had to amend every one of our business and commercial zones to allow multifamily as a use by right. It also directed us to reduce the parking standard to 1 parking space per dwelling unit in those multifamily zones. And then because they're allowed as a use by right, we also could not any longer apply our bulk and scale standards. So for instance, right now, no matter what kind of use you're doing, if you want to build something, you know, in the downtown and it's over 7,500 square feet, then you have to get a conditional use permit for that building because the footprint's bigger than a certain size. And likewise, out in the WB2, it's 10,000 square feet. And so if someone wanted to build a multifamily building over 10,000 square feet, according to our attorney and the Montana League of Cities, we could no longer apply that bulk and scale standard to multifamily because of that state law. So we had to exempt them from the bulk and scale standards for those types of uses. So that's one of the changes that we made. You know, as I mentioned, the parking requirement changed, and it also requires us, as part of that standard, to allow for off-site and shared parking. And so we amended our parking code we had to basically create a whole new chapter about shared parking because we did not allow that in commercial zones and off-site parking, modeling it on some other communities around the state that allow that. So that was a big change that we added. And then we also did some what I would call housekeeping updates. Currently our parking code that doesn't talk about the ADA parking requirements, handicap parking. It's something required under federal law, and so we added some language about that handicap spaces are required in addition to the other required parking. Also downtown, the WB3 zone, currently parking is not required for commercial uses, but if you have residential above ground floor commercial, then you can have one, or you're required to have 1 parking space. Or if it's a completely residential building in the downtown B3, you're required to meet the normal parking standards. But because of that Senate Bill 245, where we have to only require 1 parking space, no matter what, for multifamily, we had to amend that so that there is only 1 parking space required for multifamily downtown if it's, you know, on the ground floor or above ground floor commercial, either one. So that change went into effect, and then as Wendy mentioned, Senate Bill 323, which doesn't go into effect till January 1st, 2024, but it was just easier to make these changes as part of this because all the same sections are being changed, requires duplexes to be permitted where single-family homes are permitted. So effectively, in all of our single-family residential districts, which basically is from our, you know, our ag zone, 15-acre agricultural zone, all the way up to our WR1 urban 10,000 square foot zone, those are all single-family zones. We now have to allow duplexes in each one of those residential zones within city limits. And so that, basically in those particular zones, it effectively doubles the density that's allowed in those zoning districts. And so we had to amend, each of the code sections to make sure that duplexes were also permitted. We also changed, because we can't treat them any differently than single-family homes, so whatever the square footage, the minimum square footage for a single-family home is, we had to change it so duplex was also allowed. So for instance, in the R2 zone, currently it's 6,000 square feet for a single-family home, but 7,200 square feet for a duplex. We had to change that so you could build a duplex on 6,000 square feet in the B2. So we're not treating it differently. So all those changes went in. Also, because of those changes to each of those zones, we had to amend our PUD chapter, which sets minimum densities if you're doing a PUD, to include those extra densities, throughout the P. So if someone's applying for a PUD, whatever the standard density is, and then changing the bonus to incorporate the fact that no matter what, they could, do that. So you don't want to penalize somebody that's doing a planned unit development. And then in the high-density residential zones, the R3 and the R4, we had a work session with the council to talk about some changes to that zone, potential changes. As you probably know, when we put into effect our Legacy Homes program, which required people that were doing multifamily and subdivisions to set aside 20% of those units or lots to be permanently deed restricted as affordable housing with the Legacy Homes program. But then the state legislature at the last session 2 years ago basically eliminated our ability to do that, made it, illegal in Montana for a municipality to do any rent control or require affordable housing. So we changed our Legacy Homes into an incentive-based program, but we didn't, at that time, we didn't really change the code. And when the Legacy Homes went into effect, in order to capture more conditional use permits, because in order for us to require somebody to do affordable housing, we had to have a discretionary permit. So it had to be something that went to the planning board of the city council for final approval. And so we modified our R3 and our R4 zones. So prior to our Legacy Homes programs, and the RWR3 allowed up to 4 units or a fourplex by right, and then it was a full conditional use permit for 5 or more units in that zone. Because of the Legacy Homes program, because we wanted to capture more units in there, the council had us change that code to be up to 3 units in the R3, and then it was an administrative conditional use permit for 4 to 8 units, and then a full CUP for 9 or more. What we're proposing in this code is, because we had a work session with the council, and they said, yeah, it's probably a good idea to go back to that, especially since multifamily is going to be permitted as used by right in all in the commercial zones. So we should probably, open up these R3 and R4, which are our high-density zones, to allow for more units to go in. And so the proposal in the R3 is to go back to what was allowed before, 1 to 4 units as a permitted use, and then but we're going to keep it as an administrative conditional use permit for 5 to 8 units, and then 9 or more would be a full CUP. And the R4 zoning district, prior to the Legacy Homes, there was no limit on the number of units. If you could meet the lot coverage and the setbacks and the parking requirements, that you could build as many units as you wanted on a WR4 lot. When the Legacy Homes program went into effect, we changed that so you could only build a fourplex in that zone by right. So that was a big change from unlimited to a fourplex. And then with the administrative CUP, you could do up to 18 units, and then a full CUP for 19 or more. So this proposal is to not go back to unlimited, but allow for up to 18 units as a permitted use, as a use by right, and then an ACUP for administrative CUP for 19 or more, and nothing in there would go to a full CUP. You probably got on your desk a comment from Daniel Sitter, who's the new director of Housing Whitefish, and he makes some suggestions to perhaps increase that up to 20 units for the R4, up to 10 units by right in the R3. I don't know if that's something that the council will be palatable with. We certainly would want to have a little more input on his suggestions with regard to the minimum lot sizes and the setback reductions. And we just got this today, as you guys did. But, it's certainly worth considering, looking at those zones. The easier it is to build, the more housing we're going to get. But it also, we're not going to be able to have much input from the public when those types of things go in. And So, yeah, I don't know, it's one of those things that you guys should probably discuss. I do like his ideas for parking space requirements, which we'll talk in a little bit. There's also the bill that Wendy mentioned to talk about accessory dwelling units. We didn't tackle that one right at this time. We're gonna talk, it's not, doesn't go into effect till January, so we're gonna work on that after this goes into effect. As Wendy mentioned, and I went through, we changed the definition of duplex and townhouse to differentiate better. We did a bunch of housekeeping changes, the shall and the must types of things. One other aspect that we changed is there's a bunch of stuff in our code about manufactured homes that was from way back in the day when HUD had a whole different standard on what a manufactured home was. And then at that time, there was a bunch of crappy old trailer houses that were around Whitefish that were built in the 60s and 70s that weren't built to modern standards. You cannot even buy those anymore. Anything that's manufactured now has to meet certain HUD standards. So our code being antiquated, we decided to modify that. It's because the legislature passed some language that talked about, incentivizing tiny home construction in the community. And so we have two ways to look at them. They can either be looked at as an RV, or if they're put on a permanent foundation, then they're the same as a manufactured home. And each one of our zoning districts right now has manufactured home type A as a permitted use in each zone. And all we're doing is changing our definition to say a manufactured home or a tiny home. As long as it's on a permanent foundation, we look at it the same as any other dwelling unit. And so all that, those changes went into effect. And we also looked at manufactured home parks to basically facilitate someone, building a manufactured home park and also allowing tiny homes, or somebody that wanted to do a specific development using the manufactured home or RV park standards to allow for tiny homes. I'm not sure if we'll see any of those, but at least we're making it easier for people to be able to do those types of developments. One big change we did is just to make it simpler for people to go through the code, we added some tables of all the setbacks and other development requirements for each of the districts, so you have an easy place to look up each of the zones, what the setbacks are, what the lot coverage is, all that stuff, rather than have to go through each district. Something that just we've been wanting to do for a while, and it was a good opportunity to do that. And then one other just minor change is something that the council talked to us about at one of their work sessions that they had, or their council retreat, which was looking at the WE3 zone downtown. And this has nothing to do with the legislature, but making hotels and motels a conditional use in the zone rather than a permitted use by right, which just allows the council to have more input in how those things operate and where they're going to be located and their size and scale and all that stuff. So in general, I don't know if you have copies of this and you have any specific questions. There's really the off-street parking, all the other stuff is pretty cut and dry. As I went through kind of covering it, there's a lot in there. I mean, there's pages and pages and pages of zone changes. Just the text amendment itself, is over 90 pages long, 91 pages of text amendment, so there's a lot to go through. Within the parking standards, as I mentioned, we have a whole new thing with regard to shared parking. They have to have some kind of a permanent joint use agreement between the parties that basically says, as long as this agreement's in effect, then you can do, shared parking or offsite parking. If that goes away, then your right to do offsite parking goes away too. And then there's some distance requirements of how far those things can be away from the front doors and things like that. So I don't know if you have any questions about that stuff. And then as we talked about with regard to the parking requirements, we had to make some changes within that. And because the multifamily goes down to one space per dwelling unit in all commercial zoning districts, we felt like it was a good opportunity to look at the other multifamily dwelling parking requirements, because that's been somewhat of an issue for some developers. And just nationwide, the parking standards are being reduced for all kinds of units to make it easier to develop. It creates, less impervious surface, more environmentally friendly, less runoff, and it just doesn't make sense as we move into the future where there's, potentially more opportunities for, people reducing the number of cars they own, for doing other types of multimodal transportation to get to and from places. And so it doesn't mean that someone developing something couldn't build more than that, but this is the minimum. And so we had to reduce the commercial down to one space per studio efficiency unit. and then 1.5 spaces per one-bedroom unit, 2 spaces per dwelling unit. So that all stays the same, but we're getting rid of the guest space requirement, which is 1 guest space for each 3 units. But we're also adding in the ADA requirement, so based on the number of parking spaces in there, that's in addition to the parking. So they're gonna have to still provide whatever ADA is required under federal law. So, I mean, really, it's kind of a wash in a sense. But as I mentioned, you know, the only comment that we got on any of these changes came from Daniel, and he recommended, you know, the parking space going to, for a one-bedroom unit, just decreasing that to 1 space, and 2-bedroom units going to 1.5 spaces. And that's pretty standard, what most communities are looking at nationwide and around Montana as well. So that's something that you guys could consider. And then just, you know, one of the things we deal with around town, which is just kind of a housekeeping item, is there's been a lot of restaurants that have put outside seating in, like a considerable amount of it, but they haven't had, you know, a commensurate amount of off-street parking to deal with that. And so we're adding some requirements for outdoor seating, 1 space per table, that haven't been in the code previously. And then we did a little change for adding gas stations and car washes, because that's something that wasn't in our code. We just talked about service stations. The one thing we didn't add that's come up occasionally is like mini storage units go from the warehouse requirement, which is 1 space for each 800 square feet of gross floor area. That's come up several times over the past, you know, while, and we didn't add that change in there, but that's something that potentially could be added in. As far as the rest of the code, again, we talked about definitions. I read you guys the definition of duplex. We added some language for dwelling groups or clusters. Detached single through fourplex units are grouped together. We changed the definition of multifamily from 3 units to 5 units, and then clarified it a little bit because our definition was antiquated a bit, to say that they're attached units with a common separation like a ceiling or wall, and typically have their primary access through a common hallway or corridor, but that's not always the case. And then our definition of single-family dwelling, we added single-family dwellings also include tiny homes and manufactured homes with or without a chassis, with tow hitches, wheels, and axles removed, affixed to a permanent foundation. So those things fall into that category. As I mentioned before, we added a definition of tiny home. We based it upon the state's definition, which is a small dwelling unit without a chassis, with or without a chassis, defined and built to the standards of Appendix Q of the International Residential Code. And then manufactured home, you know, there's a huge, long definition in our code about Class A and having to have certain roof pitches and all kinds of other stuff. Just throwing all that out the window and just going with the modern definition of it, which basically says that it's a dwelling manufactured under HUD's Manufactured Home Construction and Safeties Act, built off-site and delivered to a site. It does not include RVs. And then, as I mentioned, manufactured home park, we did add tiny homes or recreational vehicles as being allowed to be in those things, potentially. And then manufactured home subdivision, which would allow for tiny homes. Changed our definition of mixed-use development to meet the state standard, which talks about like basically 50% of the total square footage of the development are limited to the first floor of the building, 2 or more stories. Allowing manufactured home or tiny homes in a recreational vehicle park. We did not have a definition of sublot in the code, even though we talk about it in there quite a bit. And so that's something that we added, which is a portion of a platted lot designated for separate ownership from other portions of the lot and used for a townhouse or other construction that has separate ownership with a common party wall location identified on the plat. And then I already read you guys our definition of townhome. So that's the whole thing in a quick summary, all 130 pages or whatever it is. Be glad to try to answer any questions that you guys have.
Questions for Dave? Toby?
To make some of these changes, did you guys just read this page by page and compare some of ours to the legislative changes and to the national recommendations, or?
I mean, basically, I mean, if you had the packet, you had copies of what the legislature said. Some of that's, pretty general, but, we had to go through every single chapter of the zoning code and say, all right, how does this apply to this chapter? How does this apply to this chapter? and go, and make all those changes. And then in certain areas like the shared parking thing, I looked at Missoula, I looked at Kalispell, I looked at Bozeman, I looked at Billings, I looked at Helena, I looked at some nationwide areas that have shared parking. Yeah.
You guys did an amazing job. I think
Yeah,
it
we
was
had to
very good.
cram all this together pretty quickly to get it, since it went into effect, parts of it immediately, so yeah.
Just had a question. You were mentioning modular homes. And, I don't know, a couple years ago or something, there was talk of being able to gain some workforce housing by bringing in modular homes. And Mr. Doctor had noticed in the paper, there's a 4-unit modular thing for sale that's 4 different studio sort of apartments. And I checked into it and saw them. They're small, they're brief, but they didn't qualify because Whitefish has a depth requirement of 20 feet. These were modular, and modulars are only 12 feet deep or something like that.
For a manufactured home, yeah, well, that's something we're changing. We had some, Class A manufactured home standards that had to have a certain width, they had to have a certain roof pitch, they had a certain siding. Got rid of all that, and then we just classify, as long as it's on a permanent foundation and it's built to a HUD standard, then you're good to go.
That's encouraging, not that anybody wants to live in one of those things. It was a point, and I know that on that modular and things like that, I don't know if you addressed it, I didn't read the whole 113 pages. Is there any provision for, you addressed tiny homes and then modulars and things like that? What about container homes? In Europe, there's a lot of places where they put a door and window in containers and stack them up and
If you can meet the international building code with a container, then you can put one on there if it's on a permanent foundation. But it has to be, something built to code. So it'd have to meet the standards of the international.
Well, I was
building
just
code.
curious if we,
Yeah, I think there's people that have approached the building department about putting them in Whitefish. I don't know that any have been
yeah,
put in, but
okay. That's all my
they're
questions.
certainly earthquake proof, so yeah.
And mouse-proof and insect-proof and everything else.
Toby, would you like to offer a friendly to include that language in
What?
this proposed?
What
text amendment?
language?
Well, we address modular homes and tiny homes, but not container homes, which is becoming a much
We
more
already
common-
would allow them under our.
Yeah,
we don't
he
really need a
indicated that
definition.
it's in there
Something that would be
somewhere.
allowed under the
So if
building
they can
code.
be,
As long as they meet the building code.
Okay.
But it's-
Yeah. Oh, although,
Technically, they're not a home unless someone puts a kitchen and a bathroom and plumbs it and does all the stuff. Whereas a manufactured home or a tiny home includes all that stuff.
Okay.
It's considered a dwelling unit, right? So a container is just a container until someone turns it into something
yeah,
else.
you've got to do some renovations to an empty container to make it into a home.
indeed,
But,
I am a fan of those. though.
although since you mentioned that, I think we need a motion to approve before a friendly amendment relating to,
Well, first there has to be a public hearing. Right now, you're just answering questions
yeah, okay.
or asking
I'm
questions.
done with my questions.
Okay. Other questions for the board?
No questions. I see the reason for this, obviously. I'd call this a mandate from the legislature. So basically, they're defining how we do our zoning now. And it seems to be aimed at communities like this. So Bozeman, places like this that are fit into this model. And looking at the history, so when they eliminated inclusionary housing first, so got rid of our ability to do that through a mandate, I'll call it. And then go on to do this and basically upzone the whole city. So if you look at who gains here, like when it's all said and done, we can't force any inclusionary, but we've allowed all this increase in value of property by being able to do higher density. Lower parking is often a good thing, but to force communities to live that way, you see who gains. It's going to be developers, real estate agents. And since they don't have to build anything affordable, why would they build affordable in a town like this where the housing costs are so high? So I understand why we have to do it, but I really don't like it. basically. So that's just a comment.
Chris?
Go ahead, Whitney.
I would say I agree with Chris on all of that, and just wanted to touch on what Daniel had said in his email that we received today. I think that a lot of his points are really good, but I wanted to ask you guys, these suggestions from him are not something that we could do or implement in a zoning text amendment, in my opinion, but I'm asking as well, this is something that would need separate public comment, because this is very substantive and it's more restrictive in some ways. I guess building-wise, it gives you more option to build, but, so I think that we need to have public comment on this, so I want to at least say, I like these ideas. You know, I didn't look really thoroughly at them against what's already in the text that you guys have, but, you know, I just want to touch on them and then say, I think it's a different type of meeting and a different type of amendment that we would do.
Yeah, I mean, this is stuff that's, not mandated by the state and would, go even further. But yeah, I mean, staff hasn't really had a chance to evaluate that. But, changing the minimum lot size is a pretty big change within the city. Changing the setback requirements, again, and it might be a good idea. It's still something that would be a major change. Looking at the allowed number of units in the zones, I mean, that's something that we are changing. And I mean, I guess, if you guys thought that we should add even more density, you could certainly make a recommendation that way to the council. And then, the parking space requirements, again, I mean, they go further than what we're recommending, but I don't really have an issue with it. It's probably actually a good idea, but that's, again, so that's something, those two things, I think, if you wanted to make some recommendations there, I think that'd be reasonable. But, the other things, there's some stuff that we're going to look at when we do our growth policy update. Certainly we can talk about that, when we go through that, because it's going to directly affect the zoning and looking at the different types of, urban densities and things like that as we go through the housing portion and the land use portion of that.
So this public comment will obviously, this public comment via email will obviously follow into city council. And
Correct.
for us to make a comment on that is enough. We don't need to do anything as far as,
Yeah, I mean, unless you guys, were, as, a group, the majority of you wanted to recommend some other, some of those changes, certainly you have that ability. You're the planning board and you can make recommendations, so.
yeah, I think not recommending specifically these things, but looking at something like this to increase density is nice. Yeah.
Yeah, we can tack that on after a motion. Is that all? Okay. I have a question about, actually, this goes back to the memorandum, describing some of these changes, and the bottom paragraph of page 2 caught my attention. Quote, many of these amendments described below may be interim until Senate Bill 382 is fully implemented. I just was wondering about the may be versus shall be or will be component, because if we just say, I'm just looking for some guidance here from you guys. Maybe leaves the door open for some flexibility, which I think is good. Shall be doesn't, it almost sort of closes the door in one regard to, because we don't know what this 382 is going to look like yet, right?
Yeah.
I just don't want the city to be hamstrung if we can be a little flexible in that language.
Well, that was a memo that went to the city council for a work session.
Right.
That's not part of this. What we're looking at, we just forwarded it to you, so you had some background on the bills and what we had talked about with the council on that. So we included that with what
Sure.
was sent out to you so that you had,
Right, but
you were up to speed on what the council was looking at and talking
and
about.
I appreciate that, and the point I'm getting at is this is not gospel, because we have no idea what the actual bill is going to look like in the
Well,
end.
382's been adopted, but, in order for us to participate in it, it's going to be something that as we amend our growth policy and get that finished, and, our new growth policy, we're going to do in anticipation of adopting 382, because we're required to, because of the size of our town or whatever. 382 applies to Whitefish, and so we'll have to utilize that as we go forward. But we have 3 years or something like that in order to get that
Right.
put in place, and we're going to have to figure out a lot of different things with regard to 382 as we move forward.
And the reason I ask is just, largely related to like architectural guidelines, you know, duplexes as used by right in single-family zones, to me, is a substantial change. You know, I understand the definition now between the two, but our townhouses are subject to architectural control. Will a duplex have the same rigorous tests that a single family does? Can there be conditions put on those approvals, such as garages, you know, can only face alleyways or anything of that nature, where we have,
Can't do that with duplexes. We have to treat them the same as a single-family home. But a townhome, we can require that.
right, and that's where I'm getting at. These may be interim or shall be. To me, there's a difference there. If they shall be interim, we're adopting what we know to be,
Well, I mean, this is gonna be a
Compliant, right.
placeholder for several years until we know what 382 does. 382, you know, I mean, some of the stuff, we're still gonna have to probably require duplexes in every zoning district, because that's part of the, you know.
do you
Those laws
understand what
overlap.
I'm getting at here, though? Just, are we gonna lock ourselves down into something that later cannot be changed?
Well, we have to do, what is it, like, out of 15 housing kind of initiatives, you have to do 5 of them, and allowing duplexes everywhere would be one of them. Allowing ADUs as accessory to a single family. So there are things that I think we would be looking at having to do anyway,
Yep.
because of the
But we
state
also
law.
have to do, like, the
What's-
multifamily
as
and the
far as- yes.
duplexes.
No, that
Those
part
are
I
all
understand,
required,
yeah.
and so whether we like it or not, we have to put that in
Right,
place.
I get
So
that.
that's gonna be in there no matter what.
I'm just
But
looking for
what's
some
gonna
nuance
change-
in the whole thing.
What's gonna change with 382 is like our ability to require conditional use permits for things. We have to do all our planning up front. We have to say what each zoning district allows or disallows. But when it comes to conditional, you know, it's getting rid of the discretionary permit part of everything. When we do eventually adopt that, and from the beginning of the process, we have to let everyone know that's getting involved in the growth policy that this is your opportunity to talk about what kind of land uses that you're for or against. But all, you know, the other things here, like Senate Bill 245, that require multifamily and, you know, all the commercial zones.
Commercial, yeah.
We have to do that no matter what. So
Right.
that's not something that's gonna change. Same with the duplexes in every single family zone. We have a little more flexibility, like with tiny homes. But, you know, when we do our ADU requirement, it's gonna go from 600 square feet to 1,000 square feet in every zone. And then we get, one of the reasons we're not working on it right now is we gotta figure out, you know, because we did all those changes to correct, you know, give some incentives for people to build ADUs. Well, that's pretty much all gone away. They're already gonna get their impact fees waived, and they can go to 1,000 square feet already, and they don't have to require parking. So those were all kinds of things that we had sort of had in our incentives. And so can we come up with anything else that's an incentive? Maybe, maybe not, but, you know, we may just have
TBD.
to gut the whole thing and just say they're allowed, yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's it for me.
Just a comment regarding your concern for the maybe, shall, and things like that. What we're going through now is text amendments in there that are changing things from maybes to shalls, and you can, you can't. And so if we don't like it, we'll be reviewing this again, changing maybes to shalls to you can and you can't. But for now,
Unless the legislature.
we'll approve it, and
Unless, yeah,
and
unless
then
the
we'll find out
legislature does
which
something
ones
different
were
too,
wrong.
yeah.
All right. Any other questions? All right, we'll go to public comment. Public comment is closed. Let's go for a motion from the board.
I'll make a motion that we approve WZTA-23-06 as presented by the planning staff.
I'll second. All in favor, show of hands. Oh,
When
did
would
you
we
want to
do-
add a friendly? Sorry.
Yeah,
I would
an amendment.
like to add a friendly amendment that the city council considers the decreased minimum lot size and parking decrease as provided by Daniel Sitter or other applicable suggestions.
Okay. Do we have a motion?
Yeah,
For the friendly.
I'll second her friendly amendment.
Okay. All right. So, all in favor of the friendly, show of hands. Passes unanimously, and all in favor of the motion to approve 23-06, let's see a show of hands. Gardner is voting no on that. All other are in favor. Okay. Moving on to WSUB 23-01. Wendy.
We're really missing Kenny. So I think every legislative session, there are always a zillion bills about subdivision because, most communities, especially the smaller rural areas, this is how they do their planning, and they don't have zoning, they don't have development standards, they use subdivision. So there's always a lot of subdivision bills. So there were 8 bills this session. And again, under Senate Bill 382, subdivisions are going to be reviewed a whole lot different than they are now. Again, if they meet all the standards, they'll be administratively approved. So as a summary, there was a lot of stuff about subdivision exemption, and so those are things that happen that don't come through any sort of formal review. Some of them are family transfers, where you can divide your property and give it to your children, spouse, parents. So there's some more expansion of that. Previously, family transfers could only happen in unplatted property, so something that hasn't gone through subdivision review. So we don't see it super often in Whitefish. I think it's really intended to be a rural thing, like if you had a farm and wanted to let your child have a house on your property. So there's some amendments about that. There's a bill that addresses how we review new information, and it kind of really narrows it down a bit. The phasing process, and then the expedited subdivision review that bypasses planning board and goes straight to city council. Folks could use that only if they didn't have a variance, which was kind of nice. They were just meeting our standards and it was a simple project. But now they added that a variance can be reviewed through that process. The expedited one still will bypass planning board. And in fact, I think with these latest subdivision amendments from the state legislature, I can't think of well, maybe there's one example of when you guys will even see subdivisions anymore. And that would only be, I think, if someone was doing a PUD overlay with a subdivision, we probably would want to have them both come here. But yeah, pretty much planning board is done reviewing subdivisions. They limited some timeframes for subdivision exemption to 20 working days, which is a month. Usually subdivision exemptions, they're moving a lot line. Those are the most common one that we see, and it takes about 30 minutes to review. So I think it was different in other places. Currently, a minor subdivision, a surveyor or title person will go and see how many times has a lot been subdivided since 1973. And if it was 5 or fewer lots, they could go through the minor subdivision process, which bypasses planning board and goes straight to city council. They changed that date to 2003. It's just a negotiated date. I don't think there's anything magical about it. They adopted a new administrative minor review, and we'll talk about that here in a second. And then some more exemptions for condo townhouses. And then again, we still have that duplexes can't be more restrictive than single family. One of the provisions we had was that we didn't want to see lots created that required one to do a garage forward townhouse or duplex or multifamily, and so we've struck the duplex from that. So just some more of the kind of highlights. So an administrative subdivision, we previously had a waiver of preliminary plat that if it was 3 lots or less and is hooked to water, sewer, had roads, no environmental constraints, no public dedication or anything, we could approve them. And then the state legislature expanded in some ways and restricted in others, that if it's a minor subdivision, so again 5 or fewer lots since 2003, and is located into an area that has zoning, it's hooked to water and sewer, has existing access, where previously we'd allow them to put in a driveway, but I guess now you have to have existing access and doesn't require a variance, then you can go through the administrative preliminary plating process. And that is to be reviewed in 30 working days. And kind of an interesting thing about that administrative review, let's see if I can find it here, because this one is also gigantic. kind of a different process for the administrative minor. If someone objects to the planning director's determination, they can write an appeal and it goes to city council. So. The phasing kind of tightened up a little bit, so that's kind of good. I guess maybe 10 years ago, we got a phasing bill, and it said for every subsequent subdivision phase that came in, you had to go to public hearing. Sounds like down in Ravalli County, they were approving these like 100-year subdivisions with like a zillion phases, and they actually weren't doing all the analysis up front like we typically see, and so a bill was put into place. But now they've kind of narrowed that phasing, that if it all gets built out in 5 years, you don't have to go through the public hearing process. I just sort of highlighted the things I thought you might be interested in. So again, the lots, we had previously lots intended for duplexes, townhouses or greater, that they must consider the width of the lot, so the project doesn't require a garage forward design. So I struck out duplex and did 2-unit townhouse, triplex, fourplex, and multifamily, since that's our new definition. And then we aligned our townhouse definition to the definition that is in the zoning that Dave just previously described. So that's kind of it. Is there any questions for you?
Wendy?
Just on language, and it was on page 35. So 2 times you use the pertaining to land use, density, bulk, and dimensional,
Yeah, that came right out of
Okay.
the legislative bill.
yeah, so both of those, but then there's a weird comma in maybe the second one that made me question, like, wait, what does this mean and which one is correct? within 20 working days, an additional review, comma, or conditions of approval may not be imposed. So on one of those, there should or should not be a comma.
Oh, okay, I see what
But-
you're saying, yeah.
That made me question, like, what does this mean? Additional review or conditions of approval may not be imposed. That's weird language to me,
That was
And if
straight
it's-
out of the bill.
Yeah. so.
Yeah, so Missoula County, or the city of Missoula, they were approving, because there's a provision in subdivision regulations where condos are exempt from subdivision review. And in the county, they were requiring, when you condominiumized a building, that you had to go through subdivision review. And the cities are like, why would we do that? They're not dividing any land. But that was kind of the county's review process. So they provided an exemption a bunch of years ago for that, and the counties have kind of their own review process. And then, but they threw in townhouses for some reason, that townhouses and condominiums were exempt from subdivision review. So we took that to mean, well, you still have to go through subdivision to do the parent lot, but the sublot itself, the little dividing each unit up, yeah, you've already gone through subdivision review, why would you do that? Missoula took it one step further and was like, well, townhouse could be anything. It could be a detached single-family home. And so they were approving these giant subdivisions under this townhouse exemption, but having them go through kind of a conditional use permit and reviewing it like a subdivision, but under this townhouse exemption. But it wasn't really a townhouse because they didn't have party walls. And they were like dividing out land, but they weren't calling it divided. I don't know. So this is in reaction to what Missoula was doing. The rest of us were like, what is Missoula doing? We don't really understand what Missoula is doing. So the rest of us were like, no, that's not a townhouse, that's a single family home in a subdivision. So that's this bulk and dimensional density requirement thing is from, in reaction to that.
So it sounds weird because it is weird.
Exactly. But I'll fix that comma, I think you're right.
Other questions for Wendy? Okay, public comment is closed. Let's throw to a motion.
I'll move to recommend WSUB 2301 for approval.
I'll second it.
Motion and seconded, all in favor, show of hands. Motion passes unanimously. Okay. Any matters from the board? Matters from staff?
Just letting you know that we don't have any items for our August meeting. However, we are going to meet because we are going to have our growth policy kickoff meeting the week after the planning board meeting. And so we wanted to have a quick meeting with you guys to go over just what that meeting is going to entail, let you look at some of the handouts and things like that that we're going to do, and just kind of bring you up to speed. And hopefully you guys will be able to attend the kickoff and participate in that.
Will anyone not be here on August 17th?
August.
Got 3 out of 4 here.
There's no actual planning board meeting though, right?
Nope. Yep.
Oh, well, yeah, I'll be here.
Okay.
I had,
Matter from the board, Toby?
yeah, I was gonna say something. I forgot what it is, I get distracted.
All right, with that, let's adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Thank you.
Second.